everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA has been around for over 100 years. We're an organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be the agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we're so excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. We've been doing these for almost 2 years now. I can't believe how many webinars we've done. Just a few announcements concerning our call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. And as you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat anytime. You don't have to wait till like the official Q&A time. You can just type them in. We are collecting those. And if you can direct those questions to me, I'll show up probably at the top of your chat, Methodist Federation for Social Action. We can make sure that your questions are submitted to our speakers. Closed captioning is being automatically generated, so do expect to see spelling errors and other errors, but we do have closed captioning available if you need that, if you'd like that. And we are going to go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Martha Banks, a retired clinical and research neuropsychologist and a former professor at the College of Worcester and Kent State University. Dr. Banks was the 2008 and 2009 president of the Society for the Psychology of Women and is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, where she served on the Council of Representatives and several boards and agencies and committees. Since 2011, Dr. Banks has served in several roles in the United Methodist Church, including being a certified lay speaker. She is also a General Conference and North Central Jurisdictional Conference delegate, and Dr. Banks traveled to Palestine in 2012 as a delegate with Interfaith Peace Builders. Welcome to Dr. Banks.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Bridget. I want to welcome everyone and let you know about the United Methodists for Kairos Response. We call ourselves UMKR. We are a movement for Palestinian human rights, and our goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. To achieve that goal, United Methodist clergy and laity engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education to help our church and our society understand what is happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their liberation struggle. As Christians, the advocates in UMKR believe that God has called us all to this justice-seeking, peacemaking work. Today, we will have presentations, and our first presentations will address the bad and the ugly in how the press usually covers Israel and Palestine. We have two speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time. Our first speaker is Mariam Bagudi. She's a Palestinian writer, journalist, commentator, and policy analyst based in Ramallah, Palestine. She is the senior Palestine correspondent at Mondoweiss. Her reporting has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Newsweek, The Intercept, CNN, among others. Bagudi is also a policy analyst for the Palestinian think tank Al-Shabaka and has contributed to various books and anthologies, including I Found Myself in Palestine. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, she obtained a BA in English Literature and Language at Birzeit University in Palestine and a Master of Science in Sociology and Global Change at the University of Edinburgh. She has consulted in the public and private sectors in monitoring and evaluation, as well as context analysis and risk mitigation for humanitarian and development aid missions in countries such as Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as in Palestine. Her research focuses on historical relationships with social structures and hierarchies. Her political analysis focuses on the interplay between social, economic, political, and health dynamics. I give you Mariam Bagudi.
Hi, I'm gonna close the window real quick because I think there's a bit of noise outside. Oi. It's the call to prayer. I didn't time that well. But thank you for that introduction. Press in Palestine, coverage on Palestine. It's a difficult subject. Perhaps it was more difficult for me because I got introduced to it at a younger age. I remember one of the first times I was interviewed, I was maybe 18. And it was when we were protesting against factional divisions in Palestine. And this is in 2011, around the peak of what's dubbed the Arab Spring, but the series of revolts that happened around us. And I remember one of the journalists is asking, why are you here? And then asking a very silly question that I continue to be asked. Well, how can you be free if you can't even factionally stick together? And I remember I got so defensive and so insulted and, also shame. It's a questioning of yourself. Well, how can we be free if we're factionally divided? Later on, I would realize the injustice in that line of inquiry and the lack of research that was placed in it. Every nation in the world boasts about being democratic in regards to having various factions. And we have seen historically, political factions don't exactly sing together and agree. So for me, it was a vilification and a very paternalistic approach to the right to be free as Palestinians. And then came issues like, and I apologize, Marta, but for example, the notion of, well, we want a just peace for Palestinians as well as Israelis. Israel is an apartheid colonial state. That includes the population, the settlers, soldiers that are armed to the teeth, one of the strongest armies. These are all Israelis. They're the reason we're being shot at and killed and ethnically cleansed. So to say justice for both is also as though we're calling it a conflict. And this is part of, the problems with international journalism as well, especially that, from the global north, that tends to be very Eurocentric in its observation or reporting and bearing witness to other struggles, namely from the global south. So when we say justice for Palestinians and Israelis, I've never heard in my life anyone trying to create an equal and fair world by saying, let's get justice for the abused and the abuser together. It completely negates the disproportionate power relations and dynamics that are present. And it's a sign of fear. And I think this is kind of what brings us to the press and coverage, that for years I've worked with international journalists, and there was also always this fixation on both sides. First off, there isn't two sides. There's many, many more than two sides. That in of itself is reductionist, and it's homogeneizing the Palestinian population as well as Israeli settlers. They vary. So it's allowing us that, and it's to also allow, well, what about the side of the international policymakers, or what about the side of solidarity activists? These are all different sides of the quote unquote conflict. So this equalizing plays into the Israeli narrative, and it has constantly attempted to show itself as at conflict with its savage, scary, barbaric Arab neighbors. No, they're not my neighbors. They're trying to take over my lands and my home. So for me, press and journalism, when it came to Palestine, lost its journalistic integrity. I saw the impact of lobbying and pressuring on editors that for decades would be hesitant to bring on a Palestinian as an analyst, not a Palestinian as someone to narrate their personal sob story, so they can alleviate themselves from the reporting work that needs to go in, but as analysts, as experts, as intelligent enough to speak about our own reality and what we want. And this kind of pushed me to start covering Palestine independently, especially as Mariam. I grew up between Palestine and the American South. So I was exposed to racism and racial hierarchies at different levels in different ways. One that was exclusively about me in Palestine. And in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, it was about being Black. And for me to see that there kind of as an outsider and here as experiencing the pain of supremacy made me realize the importance of relaying messages, the transmission of information, the creation of knowledge. The way I represent someone is a task that comes weighted. It comes with the obligation of not seeing the world as I want to see it. I wish it was two sides and two neighbors in a conflict, but the world as it is, sadly, it is an ethnic cleansing that is labyrinthine, systemic, and very strategic. In the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, and they say defense to kind of impact our psychological wiring to imagine them as heroes when they're not. But the Israeli army in its military strategy, and these are public sources, so you can just Google that and you'll read.
We appear to have a glitch in Mariam's transmission.
There's
Please hold on for just a moment. We're going to try to reconnect with Mariam. In the meantime, as we wait to reconnect with her.
hi.
Okay, okay.
So part of that, the internet here is terrible. We only had Israel remove its restriction of our use of 3G just a few years ago. So do forgive that. But in terms of the press, they are the most integral role in mediating our reality to global audiences. And that requires understanding our language, our culture, our historical experience, because in essence, the role of a journalist across geopolitical regions is to be a translator and to translate that in a language where your audience and your readers can understand it and isn't left to ambiguous assumptions. That's, as journalists, that is what we must do. And that includes verification processes. That includes the documentation of who we interview. That includes showcasing any conflict of interest or disclosing our position and our own assumptions and perceptions and biases. But here in Palestine, that gets lost. And part of that is also the way the Israeli regime works. So every international bureau chief that comes to Palestine, from Reuters to the BBC to the New York Times and CNN, is either Israeli or they're provided with what is called by the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, a minder. That means if the journalist writes an article that compromises the image of the Israeli military as a hero to the international community, well, then that journalist will get a call from their minder saying, well, you know, we have to renew your permit, right? And it's very underhanded ways of manipulation and coercion. But journalists are also only people. So later on, I recognized, one, the importance and significance of every international editor that allowed me a space on their platform, because that came from a lot of battles and that came from a lot of confrontation. And at the same time, all the editors that couldn't. So you're left stuck with understanding, but at the same time, you're unable to afford forgiveness because our lives are literally on the line. We can't afford you to sit and think about it. And we need, and historically, and I'm speaking right now, we're in 2022, most of the massacres that happened from 1948 up until now are already documented. The documentation, the witnessing, the confessions are all there. So for me, I can't keep saying the story again and again. Eventually, we're just going to die saying, oh, we're being ethnically cleansed, and then suddenly gone. And that's a very clear reality.
You can wrap up in 1 more minute, please. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, and then it brings me, and I'm going to take just 2 minutes to bring it to a closure as a local journalist and the struggles in that. As a local journalist, I'm not biased. I'm told I am biased. I believe I'm not. But at the same time, Israel is hiring only Israeli bureau chiefs for international media and placing minders to what is supposed to be objective. And I have to constantly fight that. Then there are restrictions on movement and movement of information included. I can't travel freely. And then it brings us to the blatant audacity that we're at today. Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian journalist with Al Jazeera, was killed on May 11th by the Israeli military, which then tried to blame Palestinian militants that they killed her. And then after news agencies proved that it was an Israeli soldier, then the US government pushed for an investigation. And just last week, we found out that the Israeli military said, yes, it was probably a soldier. He didn't mean it. I'm sorry. But how about the 25 others that were killed? Was that also accidental? Are we going to keep saying oops? And yeah, so now we're at a place where we have to be braver in listening and hearing and absorbing and relaying. And I'll close it there. I'm so sorry if I took too much time.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to introduce our second speaker. Laura Al-Bast is a Palestinian American journalist, media analyst, and activist. She is currently the senior editor of digital strategy and communications at the Institute for Palestine Studies, USA in Washington, D.C., as well as an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Her publications and appearances include The Washington Post, The New Arab, Al Jazeera, Doha News, TRT World, KPFA, and other outlets. Al-Bast is an accomplished researcher focused on public diplomacy and media governance in the Middle East and Northern Africa. A skilled Arabic English translator, she has contributed to dozens of projects in video, audio, and print, including Bloomberg and The Nation. She obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Political Studies and Communications from the American University of Beirut and a Master of Arts in International Affairs and Journalism from Boston University. Laura Al-Bast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Mariam, for starting us off on this very, very infuriating topic most of the time. what I want to talk about and what I want to focus on is sort of what exactly happens when mainstream US media reports on Palestine or the Israeli occupation. And I'm going to focus on three things. I'm going to talk about the language that they use. I'm going to talk about the common themes that we see that we have to be aware of. And I'm going to talk about the connections of these journalists to the occupation itself, how they are complicit and they are not actually objective, which is, as Mariam has said, they accuse us of being biased when they're the ones who are usually biased in their reporting. Now, it's very important to understand how a newsroom works. What is in a newsroom? It is 2022 and there's a lack of diversity in newsrooms. There's a lack of journalists of color. And that causes a huge problem because it exacerbates an implicit bias and results in distorted representations of many people, many oppressed people, including the Palestinians. But what happened in 2020, when the Black Lives Movement rose up, it really paved the way for the press to look at how they cover oppression, police brutality, state violence. And that made, and we are very thankful for that to have paved the way because it allowed other oppressed people like the Palestinians to be brave enough to stand up and say, well, you know what? We know that you can report, even with a few biases, we know that you can report accurately on oppressed people. So why aren't you doing it for us? Now there's an article, and I can share the link later on. It was written by Ayman Ismail for Slate, and he had interviewed anonymously a number of journalists who work for American newspapers and broadcast news who said that it is very difficult for them to report the truth. Because it's not just, even if their editors are fair and their editors see that this has to go out, there are top tier editors on top of them. There are people who are funding the newspaper who have certain political opinions that don't want to criticize Israel. Just look at Politico. The new owner of Politico came out and said that everybody has to recognize the right for Israel to defend itself. Oh, I'm not going to make you sign a document about it, but that's the bias that's going to be in all the reporting. That's one thing to note. Others have either had their articles removed, words changed, or they just self-censored because they felt too afraid to actually come out and say anything. Now, we all know Ayman Muhyiddin, who's on MSNBC, and he does an amazing job at really reporting and talking about Palestine. But in 2014, when he was in Gaza reporting on the killing of the children who were playing on the Gaza beach, he was removed from his post in Gaza, and because of a social media uproar, they reinstated him. So that shows you that we have power when we speak up, when we know that someone's trying to do their job, but their employer doesn't want them to do their job. Now, when we talk about the technical aspect of newsrooms, everybody follows a set of rules, the Associated Press Style Guide. Now, the Associated Press Style Guide says you can't use the word Palestine because it's not a nation, it's not sovereign, it's not recognized. All of these can be debunked with one thing. They use Taiwan, they use Cyprus, they use names of other countries that are not recognized by everybody, but are recognized by some people. And it just shows you that there's a specific bias towards Palestinians. But even within their own style guides, there's an issue of this pro-Israel watchdog media. American newspapers often publish corrections that say, oh, we're sorry, we used Palestine here, or we're sorry, we use the word settlers. It's because there's an organization and multiple organizations like it called Camera, which apparently is a pro-Israel media group that bombards editors with emails and statements saying, hey, you can't use that word. You're being unfair towards Israelis. You have to report accurately, when in fact it's just pro-Israel bias in the news. And it's important to know that there is a huge Israel media lobby that's trying to remove any accurate and fair reporting, but people are speaking up. More than 2,000 Canadian journalists signed a letter calling for fair coverage in the news. More than 500 American writers and editors signed a letter calling for fair coverage in the news. The Canadian journalists face retaliation. Some of them came out and said that they have been reassigned from covering Palestine because of the letter that they had signed. So there is a small shift, and we can talk about it a little bit later, but when you're reading and when you're listening to news about Palestine, Mariam talked about this. They say both sides, right? They use passive voice. Oh, Palestinians died. It's accidental. But when Israelis die, it's intentional, right? They omit a lot of context. They omit a lot of stories. And in omission, there is a political choice in telling the people, this is what we want you to know. We don't want you to know anything else. There's misrepresentation of facts. You know, Mariam talked about Shireen Abu Akleh. When Shireen was killed, the New York Times published a lead that stated that Al Jazeera and the Palestinian Health Ministry said that the murder happened because there were clashes between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian gunmen. That was a lie. But what's worse is that Al Jazeera and Palestinian Health Ministry did not say that. That correction was not made until 11 hours later. So that paragraph, that lead, was accessible to millions of subscribers and non-subscribers who just understood, oh, that's what happened, so we're going to believe it. It wasn't until activists on social media went out in an uproar criticizing the New York Times that they made the correction, they added someone else to the byline, etc., etc. Speaking up works. That's what I really want to get across here. And the other thing, you know, they seek primarily Israeli sources. They don't challenge them. Oh, a police officer said this, an Israeli police officer said this, it must be true, we're not going to question it. A military official said this, it must be true, we're not going to question it. But when they report on other third world countries, aren't they always questioning the statements of these countries? So why is Israel an exception? Why do we treat Israel as if it is a truth teller in the world? And you know, there's an experience that happened with me and in DC. A radio journalist called me and invited me and a colleague to speak about the onslaught on Gaza last year in 2021. And the reason for that is because he had invited an Israeli occupation forces spokesperson who talked very casually about the concept of knocking on the roof. When Israelis send a small rocket, a small missile, to the rooftop of your house to tell you, hey, we're gonna kill you in 2 minutes, so get out. And they just breeze through it as if that's a normal thing that happens. Like right now, I'm sitting in Foggy Bottom in DC, and if someone knocks on my roof, I'm just gonna walk out so I don't die. That's not normal. So they had calls from local listeners saying, hey, what the hell is this? Can you please talk to a Palestinian? And so they brought me and the colleague, and we really talked about what was actually happening. And I had never been invited to speak before. So to me, that was also a shift in terms of like, they're looking at young speakers at the same time, right? Young Palestinian speakers. But he asked me about Hamas, which is a common question every single Palestinian is ever going to be asked, because apparently I look like I'm a representative. And I had to tell him, like, I'm not gonna answer that. And he felt the need to stop recording the interview to tell me that he is a journalist of color and he does not condone any acts and he did not mean to offend me. And then he went back to it. I'm like, why did you ask me that question? What is the relevance of that question? And you know, just to wrap up a little bit, it's also what they also do when they frame things is they do a lot of PR work for Israel. So most of the time, reporting on Palestine spikes when there are incidents or moments of escalation or escalation of violence, right? That's when we usually see Palestine in the news going viral. But on the off times, which is really does not exist, look at Masafriata, they just arrested a journalist, they keep demolishing homes. We continue to be ethnically cleansed, but it's not newsworthy. But what they do on the off times of these reportings is that they do a profile about a Palestinian with an Israeli citizenship who's a normalizer, who doesn't believe in the protection of Palestinians, and how he's a huge tech guy and he has 60 million followers, and look at the controversy he causes within his community. They do a piece about this Olympics team that Israel is sending, I don't know, to play in Tokyo, and look at them, they're so great. They talk about Israel as the underdog surrounded by their enemies. They find many ways to sort of put this idea in our head that Israel is a democratic country. Look, they're just like us, they play sports, right? Look, they're just like us, they have social media influencers. We love them, we like them. So I just want to, you know, put that out there. And, you know, the last thing, you know, I'll focus on is just, I talked about a little bit complicity to the occupation. So many bureau chiefs of the New York Times in Jerusalem have sons who have served in the Israeli occupation forces. Isabel Kirshner, who I hate, I'm just going to say it, is a reporter on Palestine and Israel, and she has a son and husband who served in the Israeli occupation forces. The board of directors of the New York Times do business in Israel. They play ads for their companies on Israeli TV. They own gaming companies in Israel. So when we talk about follow the money or follow who owns these media corporations, these are people with interests, with interest in profit. These are Americans with interest in profit. And that's why when someone files a story and they talk about how Palestinians were killed, and that story gets rewritten and reframed and repurposed, even if editors are for it, it's because there are all these other lines, all these style guides, all these owners, all these rules, not really hidden rules, that they have to follow in order to report in what they believe is accurate. And what I will leave you with is a recent article from the Wall Street Journal where they talked about, they're talking about ceasefire and Islamic Jihad and everything that happened recently. But then they mentioned this one paragraph about, and I'm sure all of you have seen it, of the children who are brothers and one cousin who were killed, targeted and killed at a cemetery in Gaza. And they put that line without any context. They refer to it as an incident where children died. They don't say who killed them. They don't say what the incident is. They don't name their names. They don't say their ages. It's just a casualty. It's an accident that took place as Israel preemptively defended itself. So I'll leave you there. And yeah.
Thank you both for introducing this topic and giving us a good picture of where we are right now. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to shift a little bit and ask about any improvements you have noted in the press, what the significance is of those, and what might be the reasons for any changes. Where are the changes coming from? And we really would like to hear whatever opinions you have on this subject. And either one of you can go first.
Okay, all right, I'll go. Okay, so, and this is just, my personal observation, my personal opinion. I'm sure that there are, other opinions on this, but I do feel that, yes, that there is a shift. I think it's subtle. I think the battle for us as Palestinians to really reclaim our narrative has only gotten harder as we become more visible. But there is a shift. And the shift isn't just in the news coverage, it's in the politics of the US mainstream. There are more Congress people now saying the word apartheid. There are more Congress people attending protests for Palestine. Like last year, Rashida Tlaib and Andrew Carson actually attended a pro-Palestine protest. There are significantly more Democrats who lean towards Palestine or who lean towards holding Israel accountable than there was ever before. But there's also a prominent number of people who don't have an opinion or don't care. So that's also something to keep in mind. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. But I will say that as well, you need to be alert of what are these institutions and why is there a shift in some and not in others. If you look at CNN, the majority of their audience are probably from the older demographic. They're more pro-Israel, they're more interested in domestic politics, which is why most often we see Palestinians on CNN International, not on CNN America, right? And there are more Palestinians coming out and speaking. And 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have social media the way that we have it today. There's amateur reporting, there's citizen journalism that is in real time reporting what's happening on the ground and debunking all the lies that Israel have been putting out for decades to people. So there is a change. It's just a continuous fight, in my opinion.
Thank you. Mariam, if you can unmute.
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. I also, I like to appreciate labors. One, such as joining this panel, moderating it, hosting it, Laura for recollecting. I know it comes from a lot of pain, also our investment in knowing so many details. But I will limit myself to answering kind of just 4 headlines and what improvements I've seen, what are the changes and why. So one of the improvements that I was able to see is the bravery of people to learn. And I'm someone that firmly believes anyone, if you want to see both sides, okay, but show both sides. And I'm certain when the Palestinian side is genuinely and accurately represented, people will recognize the justness of the cause. Without accessorizing, Israel does enough to show it. So it's this bravery of it. The second thing is the ability of communities as well as press to override things. So Israel has this thing called a military censor, and any journalist operating from the region has their stories censored if they include information about the Israeli military. Because this law does not apply in the US, many of the exposés about which weapons the Israeli military is using is being done by quite brave, I think, American journalists, for example, or European, or there are many, namely the UK. But then there is, and I think this was the biggest improvement that happened, a discourse change. I write my reports about Jenin and Nablus, and I say Palestinian resistance fighters. I don't say militants. And the ability to be able to do that, and Mondoweiss is US-based, for a mostly US-based audience is huge. The second is the ability to overcome representing this as a religious war. I'm really glad that that's kind of changed and improved in terms of coverage, because embedding it in a religious war is the way Israel continues to manipulate the reality. Oh, the Arabs just hate the Jews, right? And anything you say that's critical of Israel becomes anti-Semitic, rather than seen for what it is, which is being anti-apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And then there is the change in the way an Israeli soldier is represented and the way a Palestinian is represented. I see less and less the name terrorist, even though mostly what we're represented as are just, we're just rioting in the street for no reason. We're just decided to have a political rave instead of context. So more contextualization is coming out, more historical references I'm seeing in reports. And I'm seeing, journalists not being afraid to ask questions that will at least allow us to answer the reality if they can't say it. In terms of the changes of the where, how, and what, I'm going to kind of come back to Palestine now. The biggest change we've seen, I don't think is just in the narrative, because I think our narrative is being recreated as Palestinians, a new generation, new identities. We're making huge changes in terms of global communication. So we're recreating a narrative, and that means our practices and our behaviors are also changing. So that was one of the biggest changes I've seen, and it's positive. We're more unified. We no longer accept a Palestinian in diaspora and exile to ask us, what do you think we should do? Because they're involved. They are Palestine as well, and they get to control and navigate and communicate and strategize and organize with us at a very equal level. In the past, we really treated them as though they will never return. That's it. There's just the exile population. No, this is a population that can and will return. I believe vehemently that we will return, and this land will be free, because the only constant is change. And empires fall all the time. And then the second thing is the shift in the way we understand Palestine. I think a large part of it is owed to COVID. So after COVID and the destruction that we have seen, I think there was also a shift and a weakening of global populations to not be able to afford that extra energy to deny a truth, because that's mental work as well. And then the second thing about COVID was no international journalist was allowed to come because flights were being canceled and they were restricted. So when we were up in uprising, the only source of information was us. And of course, we dealt with the systemic censorship, removal of posts, and that just also exposed an entire sector's human rights violations. So I think that's also part of what happened in terms of the change. We kind of had a final chance, not because the world decided, okay, we'll hear you out, but because an entire pandemic consumed the world, that we finally had a chance to speak. And I think that's part of the change, which brings me back to my first point. Anyone that really hears two sides will eventually, come back and recognize this as an ethnic cleansing. We're growing more into ourselves.
Okay, thank you both. And I want to move on to how we can all work to improve press coverage of Palestine. And I want to let our listeners know about an initiative called WRITE, W-R-I-T-E exclamation point. This is an action initiative to bring voices that support justice for Palestinians into the media sphere. WRITE exclamation point alerts offer you the opportunity to stand up for fairness in the media and human rights in Palestine by making your voice heard among the people who generate news articles and opinion pieces. If you support universal human rights and want to see better reporting on Israel and Palestine, sign up to receive these alerts. You will receive occasional emails, about a couple a month, about articles that are relevant to the Palestinian rights movement with an action that you can take in response. No one will be checking to see if you actually wrote a letter to the editor or took some other action. So you can sign up by sending an email to WRITEALERT@outlook.com, asking to be added to the mailing list. And the address is also being posted in the chat. And this is a practical way we can all take action on what we have been hearing about today. And now I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that have been entered into the chat. So I'm going to ask our speakers if they can say, ask what other actions would you recommend that we take to improve press coverage of Palestine?
Okay, go.
Oh, okay, I'll be quick. So, in my opinion, yes, writing to the editors, calling, etc. But remember that the survival of most news organizations, and I'm just talking about the U.S. right now, depends on their audience, unless they have multimillionaire shareholders or board of directors. But papers in the U.S., broadcasting in the U.S. isn't limited to CNN, New York Times, Washington Post. There are local radio stations, there are local papers in your own cities, in your own communities that report about you for you. There are jobs in news organizations right now that are specific to audience management and audience analytics. What do our readers want to read about? What was the reaction of our readers to this thing that we covered about, I don't know, this play, this theater, etc.? They care about your opinion. So you should say something about it. Don't just write a letter to the editor for coverage related to Palestine. If you see a paper who has already done good coverage or published a Palestinian or hosted a Palestinian, send them a thank you note. And that has been done multiple times for multiple Palestinians who have been published in the Washington Post, for example. There has been letters received by the editors saying, hey, we're calling you from, or we're writing you from the Association for Middle East Journalists. We just want to say thank you so much for offering space to so-and-so, right? This happened, this is important. Show them the positivity, not just the negativity. The other thing is, which I think is important, is support independent journalism, independent journalists, independent journalism organizations, Palestinians who are reporting on the ground, seek them, raise them, talk about them. Mondo Weiss does an amazing job at looking at reporting done in US mainstream media, specifically New York Times, and debunking things that have been reported on there. We do this as well. At the Institute for Palestine Studies, we have a bias column called The Press on Palestine, and we look at the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and look, okay, why did they contextualize here? What was wrong here? What was right here? These are important to always just sort of inform yourself to really understand, how do I critically read something that has been published about Palestine? How do I critically listen to this thing? What is wrong with this and what is right with this? And lastly, you know, there are a lot of journalists who are speaking up in their own newsrooms. And I think that, and it's not just your responsibility, I think it's the responsibility of everyone to just call for more diversity in newsrooms. I think that's really important to move us all forward.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about an article that Michelle Alexander wrote in January of 2019 for Martin Luther King weekend. Her article was called "Time to Break the Silence." It's available to read on the UMKR website. And we wrote an article reviewing it and the history of Black Palestinian solidarity. But it seems that it's difficult to find anything that Michelle Alexander has written or spoken about Israel and Palestine since that essay. Are either of you aware of articles she might have written or places she might have spoken? And what do you think might have happened to prevent her from continuing to speak out?
I mean, I'm no PI, but there could be many reasons, from the political to like facing coercion to the personal. Maybe she's just doing herself, or she's like taking care of herself or taking a break. Maybe it got too much. There are many things that could have prevented her. And I just hope she's well and it's not any corrupt practice. But generally, yeah, journalists will face censorship. And I think more than anything, it's really important to check in on your local reporters, firstly, and write the more mainstream media in terms of what they're covering, whether it's about Palestine, but also Palestine is not the center of the world. So maybe asking about things like, what are you doing about US tax dollars that are going on in military when we're facing a homelessness epidemic? So it's these little things, because in the end, it's not just the coverage, it's the representation. And if you can represent fairly and justly and rightfully and bravely, then go for it and do it. The reporters tend to follow the community. So, you know, if they want something to report on accurately, show them how it is also done. Maybe they lack the language. Let's afford people their ignorance. Maybe they need resources, offer them your Palestinian contacts, give them articles you've read, but let's afford people their ignorance as well, and the right to learn and unlearn. So yeah, I answered the first question, went on a tangent.
Okay, many people get their news via social media, where algorithms are used to steer readers in biased directions. Do you have any suggestions on challenging these artificial intelligence efforts and the social media companies?
Okay, yes, oh my God, we have seen this happen over and over again. Just Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, either removing profiles, removing content. Even, you know, a few weeks ago, the Palestinian Youth Movement's page was removed because of no reason. They just want to shut us down. Well, other than algorithms, what you need to know is that there are these sort of online soldiers, let's say, online Zionist soldiers that target any mention of Palestine, Palestinians, anything that is pro-Palestine, Palestinian. They try to target one person, bombard them with tweets, reports, until they get removed or get censored. Now, there are organizations who are working to sort of expose that. They're trying to work with these big tech companies on sort of opposing that, like Hamle in Palestine, Access, et cetera. I think what we can do, and maybe Mariam can speak to this a little bit more, but I think what we can do is just keep talking about Palestine, keep tweeting about it, keep writing the hashtags, keep asking for the people to be reinstated, their accounts, et cetera, and all of that, because that makes a difference. Because it's not just the Zionists online who are capable of bringing us down. We are capable of bringing us back online and bringing us back up. So that's really important to keep in mind. And I'm really waiting patiently for the Facebook papers to come out. I don't know if you've heard, there was a whistleblower a few months ago, or I think last year, who came out and said that Facebook has been advocating for a lot of right-wing extremism pages and comments and articles and all that on their pages, including on Palestine. And there's a whole folder just about censorship on Palestine, how internal employees are speaking out about this, right? It hasn't been declassified yet, so I'm waiting for that. But also look at Google and Facebook right now. They were protesting in the Bay Area because of all these sort of censorship and crackdowns on their own opinions as employees. So this is really important to support as well. And Mariam, maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, maybe I can build on that. So Laura was also talking about, kind of their online soldiers. So just between May and June of this year, the Israeli military held its largest military training that has happened in decades in Cyprus between the end of May and early June. And part of the priorities in that training was land, sea, air, and cybersecurity. So that also means that Israel's transferring the battlefield to online interactions and communications, which makes sense because we are increasingly becoming a technological community that employs different ways of communication. So that would also entail expect an increase in censorship and expect an increase in what are very racist algorithms that are done because no one's really doing the work or asking, hey, could our algorithm be racist, or maybe possibly promoting apartheid somewhere. So it's that. But in order to override it, there are two things. I think one is call up these organizations, these corporations, Meta, et cetera. Again, as consumers, and we are consumers, we get to dictate supply and demand chain as well. So if you're silent about the censorship, that is a demand, and they will continue with it. So even at the level of economics, we need to engage better with this, these market systems. You want to make money, do a war. That's like what they're taught in Economics 101 in American Policy School. And then the second thing is, and I think this one's really where I gear towards, if you want to fight the censorship, every person that you know that is a software engineer or really good at tech, tell them to create new apps. let them send it our way. And I really think, this is how we can override. If they're going to keep censoring, let's go elsewhere. And this is the kind of community we're building together. So we're also building government structures for the online world. And this is our chance. Historically, we're living history as well in terms of laying the groundwork of what is safe there, especially now with AI and simulation and gaming. So it's, we've got to do new things.
Okay, we only have time for one more question, and I'm going to direct this to you, Mariam. What is the ministry in Israel that you mentioned that censors journalists? And can you tell us a bit more about how this outrage functions?
So it's called a military censor, and it is AI as well in terms of Israeli affairs. So Israel does not like to show the strategy it's currently playing or what weapons it's using. So journalists, Israeli journalists included, are not allowed to share certain information. So most of Israeli affairs are considered classified by virtue of being associated with the military. So they really control what is coming out. And this is what we saw last year during the assault on Gaza. Israel fed wrong information to a New York Times journalist so that they can twist the dynamics of war to their advantage. So that's also an assault on media. But the ministry was the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. But you also want to keep in mind that when it comes to media and journalism censorship, that also falls under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel. So you want to look into both their policies. And for any journalists covering the West Bank and Gaza, you want to look at the Israeli Defense Forces policies, because us under military rule also means anyone that comes here is under military rule.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd ask for a round of applause for, and you can use your little emoticon for the applause. But I want to thank Laura and Mariam for excellent presentations and leading us in a really wonderful discussion this afternoon. You have given us a real good picture of what is happening with the press and ways that we can shift and improve the coverage of Palestine around the world. So thank you both very much. And I'm going to turn this back over to Bridget. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the webinar today. Thank you again to all our speakers and our moderator. It was a really, really informative webinar. This was recorded, and so the recording will be up on both UMKR and MFSA's Facebook and YouTube channels, etc. And you'll also get emailed this as well. For our October webinar, MFSA and UMKR are joining with Voices from the Holy Land as the primary sponsors of their film salon on October 9th. And you're going to get more information about this as well in our newsletters. And I think there's some more information getting put in the chat. But in this event, we will be discussing the new film Just Vision named Boycott. And after you register, you'll receive a link to watch the film. You can only watch it between the dates of October 6th and 9th. It's not yet available to the public yet, so this is a great chance to get a chance to watch the movie before it comes out. Boycott, the movie traces the impact of state legislation that is designed to penalize individuals and companies that engage in boycotts in support of Palestinian rights. 33 states in the US have such legislation now. A legal thriller with accidental plaintiffs at the center of the story, Boycott is a bracing look at the far-reaching implications of anti-boycott legislation and an inspiring tale of everyday Americans standing up to protect our rights. We expect to have one of the film's producers and a protagonist in the film in the discussion, and we'll be sending out registration information soon. So be on the lookout for it, and this is a really great opportunity. So I hope to see you all and many more. Get the word out, share it with your friends, your congregations, your Sunday school classes, your neighbors. It's a great and important film to be shared. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you at the next call.